Alrighty, well, good afternoon and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrew Doffany. I'm the Instruction and Outreach Librarian at the New Jersey State Library, and it is my pleasure to present our presenters or our panelists for today. We have a variety of women on the program today who are members of the American Association of University Women, the League of Women Voters, as well as from the T. Thomas Fortune Cultural Center. These women and some of their male counterparts have put together a video of dramatic readings of various historical figures who were instrumental not only in the discussion and passage of the 19th Amendment, but more so about race and slavery as it relates to the right to vote as well. So it's going to be a deep dive into a portion of history that is often unexplored. So we thank them for creating this video. At the end of the video showing, we will certainly open it up for questions. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to type them in at any time using the Q&A feature in your dashboard. You can share your thoughts or questions in the chat feature, or you can email me directly if you would like, and my email address is on the screen there. At the end of the webinar, as well as in a follow-up email, there will be a survey. We ask if you have time, please complete the survey. We love hearing from you. We love hearing your feedback. And it really does help us move forward with our programming. And if you are interested in more information about the video, its cast, all of that great stuff, you can contact them at suffragistspeak@gmail.com. And that email address will be up on the screen later after the video showing. So just before we jump into the video, just a quick rundown of the Zoom dashboard for those of you who might not be familiar with. This is what your Zoom dashboard should look like if you're using a PC or a Mac. If you are using a mobile device, it will look a little bit different depending on the device you're using, but all of the features will still be there. At any point, if you're having problems, there is a raise hand button here. You can hit that button. I will send you a message and hopefully I'll be able to help you with whatever's going on. And if you do have questions or want to share some of your comments, you can use the Q&A button that's right here or the chat button here. And as I said, we'll be happy to answer your questions at the end of the program. And please feel free to also express any opinions that you have. The panelists would love to hear your thoughts about the video and the topic. So with that, we are going to jump into the video. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Good news, there is coming. Good news, there is coming. Good news, yeah, it's coming and I don't leave me behind. Good news, there is coming. Good news, there is coming. Good news, yeah, it's coming and I don't leave me behind. Oh, the starry crown in the hem, I know. The starry crown in the hem, I know. The starry crown in the hem, I know. And don't leave me behind.
On August 18, 1920, Harry Byrne, the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature, broke the deadlock between pro- and anti-suffrage forces by casting his vote in favor of ratification of the 19th Amendment. It was an historic moment. Harry's vote carried the amendment over the finish line, making Tennessee the 36th and last state required to ratify. 8 days later, women's suffrage became the law of the land. Overnight, the U.S. Constitution guaranteed 27 million American women the right to vote. It was the culmination of a fight that took more than 70 years to win, one that became the model for nonviolent protests and set the stage for the civil rights movement decades later. It's fitting to our program today that the most dramatic moment in the fight for women's suffrage took place in Tennessee, a southern state, the last one to join the Confederacy, the southern state that supplied more soldiers to the Union Army than all other Confederate states combined. Tennessee was divided by questions of race in the 19th century, and those questions were on hand 60 years later in its debate over suffrage. When Harry Byrne cast his decisive vote, he defied those in the Tennessee legislature who feared that enfranchising African American women would shift the balance of power in the South. Over the next hour, we're going to hear the voices of 6 historic figures whose experiences reflect the legacy of slavery and race as it played out in the fight for women's suffrage and beyond. Our first voices are those of Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony, both now in their 70s. It's February 1895, and they meet before a women's convention at which Douglass is to speak. They are seeing each other after some absence, and they reflect on their decades-long friendship and the events that strained that friendship to near breaking. Let me set the stage. At the time of our conversation, Douglass and Anthony are international celebrities. They had met when both were fighting to end slavery. Over time, Anthony's attention was drawn increasingly to women's rights, a cause that was also dear to Douglass, who considered himself a woman's rights man. In the 1880s, women's rights didn't add up to much. Most doors to education were closed. Professional careers were out of the question. When they married, women gave up their legal status. Their wealth went to their husbands. And not only couldn't they vote, women, married or not, by custom, were not even allowed to speak in public if men were present. In 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the fierce suffragist who became Anthony's soulmate, organized the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention to protest these conditions. It marks the start of the organized women's suffrage movement. Frederick Douglass was among the 300 men and women who attended. Stanton, Anthony, and Douglass were friends and allies, working tirelessly to end slavery and win the vote. When the Civil War began, Anthony and Stanton threw their energy into the war effort. They helped win passage of the 13th Amendment, ending slavery. And they expected that their effort would be recognized. It wasn't. The 15th Amendment guaranteed former male slaves the vote, but not women. The omission tested the Anthony-Douglass friendship and caused a rift in the suffrage movement itself. Let's listen in as Douglass and Anthony, together near the end of his life, reflect on this history.
Good morning, Mr. Douglass. Welcome.
And good morning to you, Miss Anthony. Thank you for your invitation to visit a while.
We will have tea soon, but first let me enjoy the sight of you. It's been a good while since we last talked.
It has indeed. And as I want to say how pleased I am that you will be escorting me tonight at the National Council of Women's meeting. As I contemplate that moment, I have to ask, how is Miss Stanton doing?
She is not so well and doing less traveling, or she would be with us tonight. She sends you greetings. She is my dearest friend, and I miss her. But we still, from time to time, write one more speech together. We've written so many that I've lost track of the number.
I do remember the first time I heard her speak, Seneca Falls in 1848. She astounded the crowd at the first women's rights movement meeting, when she proposed a radical addition to several resolutions, denouncing the wrongs visited upon women due to a defect of sex. Seeking redress, she proposed this addition: resolved that it is the duty of the women of this country to secure for themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. I will never forget Lucretia Mott, who cried out, "Why, Lizzie, thee will make us ridiculous. Thee goes too fast." But it was clear that moving cautious was not what Miss Stanton wanted. Even though the crowd did not seem with her, and even her husband left. I know you know the story, although you were not there, but I like to remember that of all the men at the gathering, I was the only one who spoke in favor of the motion, and the only one who voted for it. It carried by a small majority. I know there have been times where you may not believe this, but I feel strongly about the suffrage for women. I've done little in this world in which to glory except this one act, and I certainly glory in that. When I ran away from slavery, it was for myself. And when I advocated for emancipation, it was for my people. But when I stood up for the rights of women, self was out of the question. And I found a little nobility in the act.
I did question where you stood, especially in those years after the war, when our Congress proposed a 14th Amendment in which men were mentioned 3 times and women not at all. The 14th and 15th Amendments sorely tried that bond we had formed over the years. It was a bond built with countless miles traveled and local meetings held in support of the abolition of slavery. We even gave up work for suffrage to further the cause of abolition. Then the 14th Amendment conferred citizenship upon the new freed men, but it sounded a warning for us women, who generally favored Negro citizenship, but were troubled by the fact that the 14th Amendment referenced the right to vote of male citizens. Until then, the Constitution had not specifically excluded women from the vote. In fact, nowhere previously had there been any reference to sex in the Constitution. I admit that generally it was assumed that women would not vote. But we saw that the 14th Amendment would codify what had previously been custom alone. Many of us were distressed, even angered by the 14th Amendment's failure to mention women. And I still think with good cause. Remember, we stopped working for suffrage so we could work for abolition in the years leading up to the war. And women took an active part in the war effort. Remember Anna Ella Carroll, who devised the Tennessee River strategy, for which General Grant took credit. There were only a few women doctors then, but they and a few nurses, I know you remember Clara Barton, organized efforts to care for wounded soldiers. And Harriet Tubman, Harriet, headed the intelligence service of the Union in the South, as well as led troops into battle. It seemed to us then that what these women did would have put an end for all time to the notion that women are inferior. But it did not, and we were left out. We felt betrayed, deserted by our Negro and abolitionist supporters when faced with the upcoming 15th Amendment addressing the right to the vote. Mrs. Stanton and I and others working for women's rights decided that if women were not offered the vote together with the newly freed men in that amendment, we would prevent its passage. We did not succeed.
Here are some things I knew but could not say then. At least I could not say them all. I supported women's suffrage. Nevertheless, I knew that a set of circumstances, the end of a great war, the assassination of President Lincoln, the struggle between Andrew Johnson and the radical Republican Congress, the fact that the Southern states were out of the Union and could be coerced into ratification as the price of readmission into the Union. All of these created a unique opportunity to enfranchise freedmen. The northern states were either indifferent, having at the time too small a Negro population to pose any threat to their power structure, or Republican dominated, and sensing the power of 2 million new, almost certain Republican voters. I also saw that the essential northern states felt strongly about the propriety of women's voting. They were not for it. And I felt that the inclusion of women's suffrage would result in the loss of the amendment, denying the right to vote to women and the Negro alike. The 15th Amendment was of overriding importance to the very survival of the newly freed slaves. I felt only the ballot could shield them from the wrath of their former masters. Only the ballot could provide access to education. Only the ballot could guard their painfully won economic foundations. Only the ballot could provide protection from the terrorist organizations that were springing up throughout the former Confederacy. You may remember the speech I gave in 1869 to the Equal Rights Association. When women, because they are women, are dragged from their houses and hung from lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms and their brains dashed out upon the pavement, when they are objects of insults and outrage at every turn, when they are in danger of having their houses burned down over their heads, when their children are not allowed to enter into schools, they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot. And a voice shouted from the back, "Is that not true of black women?" And I replied, yes, it is true of black women, but not because she's a woman, but because she is black.
And around this time, I remember a debate that you and I had. Do you? I said, Mr. Douglass talks of the wrongs of the Negro, but with all of the outrages that he today suffers, he would not exchange his sex and take the place of Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
And I said, I want to know if granting you the right of suffrage will change the nature of our sexes.
And I responded, it will change the pecuniary position of women. It will place her where she can earn her own bread. She will not then be driven to such employment as only a man chooses for her. As I said those words then, and they still hold true, I thought of all the ways that women are denied the right to earn a living or to own property. Remember, once married, a husband can will away any property a wife brings to the marriage, even if it leaves her destitute. It reminds me of another speech that I helped Mrs. Stanton write, where we noted that in the statute books, free men hold power over women like the feudal barons held over their vassals. We knew then and today that only the vote could free us from such servitude. You and I, we have seen injustice and have worked to change it, and still women are without the vote. And I know that in the South, the Negro has effectively lost the vote and struggles under a heavy yoke. Still, I believe that women will achieve the vote. There are new leaders rising, and a few Western states have enfranchised women. As to the South, perhaps women voting will help to tame the worst impulses of men.
The next day, Frederick Douglass was dead of a massive heart attack. Anthony stayed with his widow to help with funeral arrangements. She delivered a eulogy for her friend at his memorial service. While Anthony and Douglass were discussing the racial divide in the suffrage movement, African American women were living it. The experience of black women in the fight for the vote has been, at best, underreported and for the most part, ignored. From the start of the suffrage movement, African American women were there. They too spoke out, organized, and advocated. They were both fighting for the vote and against the racial prejudices of a nation, including of the white suffrage movement. As African American activist Mary Church Terrell put it, they had the double burden of blackness and womanhood. The suffragists were about to meet. Ida Wells-Barnett, better known as Ida B. Wells, was one of these women. Wells-Barnett challenged white suffragists who were ignoring the injustices against blacks. Despite their disappointing response, she remained a staunch suffragist who organized African American women to fight for the vote and to end the racial injustices that plagued their communities. Women's clubs, sororities, and churches played a central role in this fight. They were the testing grounds for African American women to develop their leadership and advance their causes. Wells-Barnett founded the first African American women's suffrage organization in Illinois. Her work laid the groundwork for the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. But let's invite Ida Wells-Barnett herself to tell her story.
Most of you know my work as a journalist, pursuing the eradication of our national crime, lynching. I have written for many Negro newspapers across the country. Mississippi is where I was born and began my work as a teacher at age 16 after my 3 siblings and I were orphaned. The salary was too low to support a family. Fortunately, I learned I could do better in Memphis, so we relocated there. Living in Memphis enabled me to take summer college courses to earn my teaching certificate. Riding to class in the ladies' car one morning, I was confronted by a conductor who insisted I move to the colored car. When I refused, he attempted to physically remove me. At the next stop, he, another conductor, and the station master dragged me from my seat into the colored car. I was injured in the fracas and determined then and there to retain a lawyer. On Christmas Eve in 1884, the circuit court ruled that I was wrongfully ejected from my seat and ordered the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad to pay me $500 in damages. At 22, I had struck a blow against Tennessee's first Jim Crow law. Of course, that was not the end of the story. The railroad's attorney threatened me and promised they would appeal to the Supreme Court. They did, and the court overturned the verdict, saying I had intended to harass the C&O Railroad. They ordered me to pay more than $200 in court costs. I was so disappointed. I had hoped great things from my suit for my people. I had believed all along that the law was on our side and would give us justice when we appealed to it. Justice, I saw, was not intended to be ours, even when we fought for it and won. This case sparked a rage against injustice that remains with me. And while the verdict broke my heart, it toughened my spirit. I continued teaching, but I knew I was ready for another career. So, in 1884, I accepted an invitation to write a column for the Memphis Evening Star. A few years later, I wrote my first story for the Free Speech, covering the murder and lynching of 3 Memphis shopkeepers. My career as a crusading journalist had begun. I created a campaign against lynching, which many white Americans considered appropriate punishment for a Negro who had allegedly committed a crime, great or small. I was writing accounts of lynchings and making it clear that the victims were being denied a fair and speedy trial, a right to which every citizen is entitled. In addition to my writing, I had speaking engagements in many states and made my first trips abroad to lecture, garnering support to end a practice many here at home accepted as normal. I hoped British audiences would see what Americans would not: the tragic, shameful torture, maiming, and murder of its Negro citizens. Many of you are aware of the burning of my newspaper offices in Memphis and the murder of my associates. Since then, I have not returned to the South. I learned that armed vigilantes were awaiting my return. My fellow auditor and friend, T. Thomas Fortune, offered me a full-time position at his paper, the New York Age. I declined, but continued my writing and speaking engagements around the country. While I was immersed in the horror of covering lynchings, writing pamphlets, and speaking, I became more and more aware of the significance of voting and electing those who could change Jim Crow laws and speak out against lynching. Only the power of the vote could do that. The 15th Amendment brought the ballot to Negro men, not to any women. Despite the amendment, Negro men faced so many obstacles to voting that they might as well not even have the right. So my work as a suffragist is grounded in the need for the vote to be extended to all men and all women, without reservation. Remember, ladies, our cause is the same.
As events continue to unfold, the black and white paths to women's suffrage remain separate. By the turn of the 20th century, the white icons of suffrage were in their 80s and ready to pass the baton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton died in 1902, Susan B. Anthony in 1906. Aunt Susan, as Anthony became known to the young activists, spent the last years of her life grooming the next generation of white suffragists. Among that next generation was New Jersey's own Alice Paul, born in 1885 in Mount Laurel. Paul, like Susan B. Anthony, was a Quaker, a group that had long stood for the equality of all human beings. Paul studied in England after graduating from Swarthmore and later earned doctoral and law degrees. While in England, Alice Paul joined the militant British suffrage movement. She organized, marched, and was arrested multiple times. In prison, she joined the hunger strikes of her fellow suffragettes, as they were called in England, and endured the tortures of force feeding. Paul returned to the United States in 1910, ready to take up the suffrage cause here with the passion and activism she'd learned from her British mentors. But what she found was a national suffrage movement that had lost its momentum. Its tactics were conservative. Its enthusiasm was waning. It was focused on waging state-level campaigns to win suffrage, and it hadn't won a state in years. Paul had no patience for this. She joined the National Suffrage Organization and immediately began arguing for a federal suffrage amendment and radical, headline-grabbing tactics. Her first big splash was the 1913 Women's Suffrage Procession, a high-profile, nationally covered, 5,000-plus women's parade in Washington, D.C. on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's first inauguration. The march was a big deal. Women traveled to the Capitol from around the country. The police failed to provide the requested protection, and hecklers in the crowd harassed and injured marchers. Pictures of the assaults and the pageantry made papers across the nation. It was just the buzz and the shot in the arm Paul intended. But behind the scenes, there was a complication Paul did not intend. In the lead up to the march, political realities were vying with moral principles, and the complex question of race was once again on the table. Alice Paul was confronted with a moral decision that, as it turns out, will bring Ida Wells-Barnett back on our stage. Let's imagine Alice Paul as she struggles with the race question in an imagined letter to her sister. It's 1913, days before the grand suffrage procession.
So long ago we sat beneath.
Oh, dear sister, please hear me out. I'm in a quandary. A decision is being forced upon us regarding our march, and in making it, I must find a balance between our Quaker heritage and the realities of today. The matter about whether colored women are welcome in our procession has come up again, and right on the eve of our march. In early January, when someone first inquired about this, we thought that not many Negroes would want to participate. So we said yes, a few might be tucked among friendly women from the North, and they would not be very noticeable. Later, a woman wrote to our journal asking whether Negro women could march, and then I began to worry that the question might be publicized. What if a majority of white marchers were to say that they refused to participate if Negroes in any number formed a part of the parade? But as a Quaker, I am predisposed to side with and not against the Negro in any question of racial difference. But racist feelings in Washington have been very bitter this winter, and I am worried that we must have a white procession or a Negro procession or no procession at all. I thought it would be best to say nothing whatever about the question because we wanted to keep it out of the newspapers. At first, our journal editor agreed. Then one of the national officers heard about this, and she was very upset. She wrote to me that we could not even think of turning down an application from colored women. The suffrage movement has to stand for enfranchising every single woman in the country, both black and white. But still, I worried, especially when we received a stream of inquiries. Just recently, I heard from a group of young women at a colored sorority here. They wanted to march in the college section. I delayed answering, thinking that there were only a dozen or so, and perhaps they would not be noticed. Other groups of Negro women will be at the end of the procession. But then today, I learned that there is a colored woman in Chicago who wants to march with the Illinois delegation. It is probably that Mrs. Barnett, who has fought so fiercely against lynching. What should we say? Mrs. Barnett will not march at the end of the procession. But does she not know how much her insistence can damage all we are working for? So many women from all over the country have worked so very hard to make this grand procession a success. Our floats, our music, our banners, even our disputes, we have managed to keep them from becoming public. But this woman from Chicago, she is a journalist. If she objects to marching at the end of the procession, she will probably talk to the newspapers. And oh, we do not want that. But, dear sister, in saying this, am I being unfaithful to our heritage? As Quakers, we have long struggled for the equality of all. We fought to free our colored brethren from the oppression of slavery. Now our black brothers can vote along with our white brothers. And when our campaign for women's suffrage is finally successful, our black sisters will be able to vote along with the rest of us. Can that Chicago woman not understand this? Would she doom our campaign? The colored women have their rights, and our family has helped to fight for them. But what of the other women, those who do not agree with those rights? Must I not support them as well? And will any of us, Mrs. Barnett herself, or our sisters in the South, both the colored women and the rest, benefit by endangering the success of our cause?
Alice Paul made her decision. The women's suffrage procession was held on March 3, 1913, and her instructions were that African American suffragists should march at the end of the parade. But that's not the end of the story. Let's listen to Ida Wells-Barnett, that Chicago woman, tell us how she responded to Alice Paul's instructions.
The end? The end, you say? Behind the white women. The Negro women would march alone at the end of the parade? That is your thinking? Your solution? That we should be pushed back, hidden, an afterthought? What would even make you think that would be acceptable to us? Yes, it would make it seem like we are not part of your effort. Oh, is that it? You think we hurt your cause? Foolish. Is it not the same cause, the same goal? No matter which color we are, men refuse to let us have the vote. We are all women. When the 15th Amendment was passed, it was as lost to us as it was to you. And you think it important to secure your suffrage above ours? We reject that. Yes, all men have the right to vote, but in the case of Negro men, not the means. Oh yes, I know. Some of you agree that we're all sisters in the struggle, but not all of your ranks agree. The majority of your Southern members wish to have nothing to do with us. Our presence in this right and their parade will ruin white women's chances to win the vote. And they say my presence will annoy them, will ruin their cause. Is it not the same cause? Aren't we women too? Aren't I a woman? Yes, society views us separately, differently, as not part of your world. Clearly, this organization holds the same view. I see that you hold the separation higher than the desire to vote, higher than the need to stand tall together as we face down tyranny. No, I will march with the Illinois delegation, and the Southerners be damned if they don't like it. You should know the Alpha Suffrage Club of Chicago was formed by Negro women and 2 white women, and the white women were relegated neither to the front nor the back. We marched together, side by side. You all know of my work, my anti-lynching work, and my crusading journalism to expose its horrors, as well as to pass legislation to make lynching a crime anywhere in the United States. Yes, the work of gaining the vote is a lever to be used against lynching. People who are free and able to vote can lift the nation beyond what keeps it mired in hatred for its black citizens. You stood with us as we pushed to abolish slavery so that everyone could be free. And I believe, as I think you do, that a free citizenry that can exercise its power to vote and change things. We must all believe that is so. Else, why are we here at all? The Alpha Suffrage Club and the Women's Second Ward Republican Club are anti-lynching and pro-suffrage organizations. Any white women who see fit to join with us do so as equals, not superiors. Susan B. Anthony once tried to convince me that when women get the vote, everything will change. And with Negro and white women working together, I think it might be possible. But if we are to be relegated to the rear anytime someone fears their cause will be lost, I am afraid I cannot be convinced. No, I will not dress up prejudice and call it politics, nor will I allow anyone else to do so. I will march with the Illinois delegation, or not at all. And believe me, I intend to march.
Ida Wells-Barnett marched, and she marched with her fellow suffragists in the white Illinois delegation. Alice Paul, the moving force behind the 1913 women's suffrage procession and towering figure in the fight for the 19th Amendment, had a rival in the movement. The conservative state-by-state strategy that so frustrated Paul on her return from England was spearheaded by Carrie Chapman Catt, Susan B. Anthony's hand-picked successor to run the traditional national suffrage organization. As leaders of the 20th century wave of the movement, Paul and Catt ran two separate, parallel campaigns with different focus and different tactics. Paul was militant and aggressive, focused on a high-profile, Washington-targeted strategy for a federal suffrage amendment. She took the fight directly to President Wilson. She and her supporters picketed, served jail time, refused to eat, and endured forced feeding. Carrie Chapman Catt skillfully masterminded a less strident but equally determined campaign to gain the vote, one state at a time. A federal amendment required 2/3 of both houses of Congress to pass the proposed language and 3/4 of the states to ratify, state legislature by state legislature. Clearly, the power for change rested with the states, and each has 2 senators, regardless of its size, and each has an equal voice in ratification, regardless of its size. In the U.S., in 1920, as still today, there were and remain stark regional differences among the states. Those differences intruded their way directly and painfully into the fight for the vote. The southern states feared the enfranchisement of African American women, and ratification required the support of at least some of those southern states. Both Alice Paul and Carrie Catt were challenged to win these southern legislators to the cause. And as Frederick Douglass had calculated that adding women to the 15th Amendment would jeopardize its ratification, now the white suffragists made a similar moral compromise in wooing the racist factions in the South. Let's return to where we started, Nashville, 1920. Catt was there. Paul stayed away, knowing her controversial tactics would make her a lightning rod as ratification in the last state played out. We're about to imagine the thoughts passing through the mind of Carrie Catt, now a global personality and an acknowledged titan of suffrage, as she celebrates the outcome of the vote in Tennessee and reflects on what it took to get there.
It came down to this. The state of Tennessee was our last hope. Congress had passed the women's suffrage amendment, and 35 states had ratified it. One more state would take us to the 3/4 required by the Constitution. But 8 states had already defeated the amendment. That left only 5. We had no chance in North Carolina and Florida, and we knew it. In Connecticut and Vermont, the governors refused to call a special legislative session to consider the amendment. That left only Tennessee. Tonight, the political fate of the women of the nation rested in the hands of a minority of a single state legislative chamber. The moment was intensely dramatic. Every onlooker knew that the fate of the question might depend upon a single vote. When young Harry Byrne cast his vote for women's suffrage, the House broke into an uproar, and the cheers of triumph that rang through the old legislative chamber were heard far down the street. The Woman Suffrage Amendment, introduced in Congress in 1878, when I was but 19, will now become the law of the land. So, how did we finally reach this point? My plan, I called it the winning plan, was to organize in the states. And in Tennessee, we surely organized. Listen to how we did it. The women of Tennessee laid aside their political differences and worked together in a manner worthy of imitation by the men of the state. The southern summer heat was merciless, and many legislators lived in remote villages or on farms miles from any town. Yet the women trailed these legislators by train, by motor, by wagons, and on foot, often in great discomfort and frequently at considerable expense to themselves. They went without meals, were drenched in unexpected rains, met with tire troubles. Yet no woman faltered, and there was not a legislator who had not been visited by his women constituents before the legislature met. Other suffrage leaders had followed other paths. You've heard from one of them, Alice Paul, who organized parades and protests and was even jailed to draw attention to the suffrage cause. My path, as I said, was to organize in the states, but even more, to bring the struggle to states where we could win. And in addition, in these states, we needed to choose arguments that could win. So yes, when I campaigned in the South, I did say that white supremacy would be strengthened, not weakened by women's suffrage. And I told them why. Here are the numbers. In the 15 states south of the Mason-Dixon line, the total Negro population is 8,294,272, but the total population of white women is 8,708,924. White women outnumber both Negro males and females by nearly 500,000. If the South really wants white supremacy, it will urge the enfranchisement of women. Yes, I did say those words, and I compiled those statistics for our Southern brethren. But listen to this and hear me now. The South professes to fear the increased Negro vote. The North, the increased foreign vote. The rich, the increased labor vote. The conservative, the increased illiterate vote. Certain elements fear the increased Catholic vote, and still others the increased Jewish vote. Ballot reformers fear the increased corrupt vote, and corruptionists fear the increased reform vote. Ridiculous as this list of objections may appear, each has been supported earnestly by a considerable group, and collectively they have furnished the basis of opposition to women's suffrage in and out of Congress. But the answer to one is the answer to all. Government by the people is expedient, or it is not. If it is expedient, then obviously all the people must be included. The struggle for women's suffrage is no white woman's struggle, but every woman's struggle. Everybody counts in applying democracy. And there will never be a true democracy until every law-abiding adult in it, without regard to race, sex, color, or creed, has his or her inalienable voice in government.
Carrie Catt took us up to Nashville, August 1920, where the 72-year fight for the vote ended with Tennessee's ratification of the 19th Amendment. And she left us with stirring words on the meaning of democracy. But the fight for the vote didn't end for everyone in 1920. African American women continued to bear the double burden of their blackness and their womanhood. Jim Crow laws, with their poll taxes, literacy tests, and tolerance of intimidation and violence against African Americans, continued to deprive black women and black men of their vote. Fannie Lou Hamer, our next player, knew this intimidation and violence firsthand. She was the youngest of 20 children born in Mississippi in 1917. She lived the outrages of racial violence, including undergoing sterilization without her consent during surgery to remove a uterine tumor. In 1962, outraged by efforts to deny blacks the vote, she turned her attention and formidable talents to voters' rights. She became a political organizer and powerful voice in the civil and voting rights movements. By 1964, Hamer had a national reputation. She had co-founded the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and challenged the pro-segregation state Democratic organization. She led her group to the 1964 Democratic National Presidential Convention in Atlantic City and asked to be recognized as official delegates. We're about to hear Hamer's speech to the Credentials Committee at that convention. Television coverage of her appearance was preempted by a press conference called by President Lyndon Johnson to deprive her of a live national audience, but Hamer got the last word. Her speech, televised later, was seen by millions and helped build support for her cause. The 1964 Credentials Committee denied Hamer and her party delegate status. 4 years later, in 1968, Fannie Lou Hamer served as a member of Mississippi's first integrated delegation to a Democratic National Convention. Let's hear Hamer's 1964 speech and the words that laid the groundwork for the 1965 Voting Rights Act a year later.
Mr. Chairman and the Credentials Committee, my name is Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, and I live at 626 East Lafayette Street, Ruleville, Mississippi, Sunflower County, the home of Senator James O. Eastland and Senator Stennis. It was the 31st of August in 1962 that 18 of us traveled 26 miles to the county courthouse in Indianola to try to register to become first-class citizens. We was met in Indianola by policemen, highway patrolmen, and they only allowed 2 of us to take the literacy test at the time. After we had taken this test and started back to Ruleville, we was held up by the city police and the state highway patrolmen and carried back to Indianola, where the bus driver was charged that day with driving a bus the wrong color. After we paid the fine among us, we continued to Ruleville, and Reverend Jeff Sonny carried me 4 miles in the rural area where I had worked as a timekeeper and sharecropper for 18 years. I was met there by my children, who told me the plantation owner was angry because I had gone down, tried to register. After they told me, my husband came and said the plantation owner was raising Cain because I had tried to register. And before he quit talking, the plantation owner came and said, "Fannie Lou, do you know, did Pap tell you what I said?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Well, I mean that. If you don't go down and withdraw your registration, you will have to leave. Then if you go down and withdraw, you still might have to go because we're not ready for that in Mississippi." And I addressed him and told him, and I said, "I didn't try to register for you. I tried to register for myself." I had to leave that same night. On the 10th of September, 1962, 16 bullets was fired into the home of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Tucker for me. That same night, 2 girls were shot in Ruleville, Mississippi. Also, Mr. Joe McDonald's house was shot in. On June the 9th, 1963, I had attended a voters registration workshop, was returning back to Mississippi. 10 of us was traveling by the Continental Trailways bus. It was a state highway patrolman and a chief of police ordered us out. I was carried to the county jail and put in the booking room. They left some of the people in the booking room and began to place us in cells. I was placed in a cell with a young woman called Miss Ivesta Simpson. After I was placed in the cell, I began to hear sounds of licks and screams. I could hear the sounds of licks and horrible screams, and I could hear somebody say, "Can you say yes, sir, nigga? Can you say yes, sir?" and they would say other horrible names. She would say, yes, I could say yes, sir. So well, say it. She said, I don't know you well enough. They beat her I don't know how long. And after a while, she began to pray and ask God to have mercy on those people. And it wasn't too long before 3 white men came to my cell. One of these men was a state highway patrolman, and he asked me where I was from. And I told him Louisville, and he said, we are going to check this. And they left my cell, and it wasn't too long before they came back. He said, you are from Louisville, all right. And he used a curse word, and he said, we're going to make you wish you was dead. I was carried out of that cell into another cell where they had 2 Negro prisoners. The state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro to take the blackjack. The first Negro prisoner ordered me, by orders from the state highway patrolman, for me to lay down on the bunk bed on my face. I laid on my face. The first Negro began to beat me. And I was beat by the first Negro until he was exhausted. I was holding my hands behind me at the time on my left side because I had suffered from polio when I was 6 years old. After the first Negro had beat me until he was exhausted, the state highway patrolman ordered the second Negro to take the blackjack. The second Negro began to beat me, and I began to work my feet. And the state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro who had beat me to sit on my feet. To keep me from working my feet, I began to scream. And one white man got up and began to beat me in my head and tell me to hush. One white man, my dress had worked up high. He walked over and pulled my dress. I pulled my dress back down. He pulled my dress back up. I was in jail when Medgar Evers was murdered. All of this on account of we want to register to vote to become first-class citizens? And if this Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party is not seated, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hooks because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America? Thank you.
Our suffragists have spoken. Their stories cast light on a chapter in the history of the fight for the vote that has remained in the shadows. For many of us, the story of suffrage was one of hard-fought, noble movement that marched slowly but inevitably to victory, of undaunted women and men who risked ridicule and even harm for the cause. It was this, and it was more. The battle was fierce, and it was also flawed. It still is. It's well over half a century since Fannie Lou Hamer's powerful remarks to the Credentials Committee at the 1964 Democratic Convention. But attempts to suppress the vote haven't stopped. Voter rolls are being purged to disenfranchise targeted groups. States are legislating voter identification requirements that unfairly disadvantage some populations. Districts are closing polling places to create long waits in certain neighborhoods, and more. We need to pay attention. We need to continue to protect the right to vote for everyone. And more than anything, we need to register and vote.
Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. In my neighbor's home,
Righty. Well, that was an interesting and very informative video. I'd like to ask our panelists to come and share their screens as we so now take questions from all of you. Alrighty, well, if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to send them using the Q&A button in the dashboard, or if you want to send any of your thoughts or questions in the chat, you are more than welcome to do that. And I will get us started off here with, what was the spark or impetus for creating this video?
This is Peggy Dellinger. I was the narrator on the recording, and I believe I would call on Connie. Is Connie on the call?
Is here. Yeah, Connie just showed up. Hello.
Okay, Connie,
I've been
maybe since you were part of that spark, perhaps you could explain it to us.
Oh, you mean, was the question,
What
how
was
did
the
this get going?
origination of the idea to do this?
Well, it's kind of interesting. Anne Torrey, who is not among us, but she's active in the League of Women Voters, and she and I both belong to a hiking group. And so one day, 2 years ago, more, we said, we should do some programs together. And so it was the 19th Amendment. So let's do it on this. And then I'm not exactly sure how it happened that we thought we should focus on the African-American women's experience in this. And at any rate, our first meeting was in August 2 years ago. And we met at the Ocean Township Museum, which had a marvelous display, which Peggy put together, on suffrage. And somehow Peggy was there, Marion was there, Lorraine was there, our friend Gilda Rogers from the T. Thomas Fortune Center in Red Bank was there, and who else? And Ann Torrey. And it just happened. I don't know how but it did just happen. Marion's smiling. Is that true? That's what it was. And it took on very quickly a life of its own. And we had this first performance in March of 2020, and then we were going to do it again. And we all know what happened the following week. So that's it. Okay.
So the team that Connie has introduced to you, each took an aspect of the story and did the research and wrote the script. So it's an original script based as much as possible on the actual words of the historic characters, but there is some glue that we added just to make it a narrative that had a logic and a beginning, middle, and end.
Was the decision, what do you think the advantages were to this style of communicating the history, using yourselves as essentially the characters to speak, in the words in some instances as these historical figures, versus something that's just maybe, as a narrator speaking about the historical figures and what they did, but having this more interactive element?
Maybe we could have Lorraine answer that, because Lorraine does Lorraine channels the historical figures of Ida B. Wells and Harriet Tubman and others. So she has a passion for this kind of communication, and I'm sure she can share with us why we felt it was the best way.
As an actor, I was going to volunteer to step into this. There is no better way, I think, to teach than by teaching through the example of people being in place and telling the story. You can read it in a book. You can have a narrator speak it all to you. But when you have the people who live the experience, somehow giving it to you through their perspective, it's like theater, actually. And that is the way that people are drawn in. They feel very connected. They don't get bored looking at the printed page. And they can either feel a connection perhaps to a character or to something that's being said, but it is the liveness, I think, that is what makes this so important and so special. And I hope it was wonderful to the people who were watching it, and that they would agree that we brought some life.
Andrew, we've lost your audio.
Your voice.
There we go.
There you are.
In your opinion, why do you think maybe the first round of the suffragist movement in the middle 1800s failed, but in the early part of the 20th century it was successful?
Maybe we could ask Susan B. Anthony.
Yeah.
I'd be happy to speak to that. I think part of it was simply a reflection of the historical reality that, at least in most of the history that we're aware of, women had played a deferential role. They generally rarely held power, and they had a role, but the role was primarily to be supportive of the household families. And so I think that there was a long road to travel to convince, I mean, in the end, women had to rely on male voters to decide that suffrage for women was the right thing to do, if you will, made sense, was, and so I think it took a long time to tell that story and to make the case, even though we think there was a convincing case early on. And the other thing, of course, was that it happened at the same time that a terrible fact of slavery in this country, and the folks who were enslaved, both male and female, who were denied virtually every right as citizens or as in the country. I think that took precedence at some point and became the more important political action. And some of that has to do with economics that led to the war. I mean, there are a lot of things involved, and I'm sure there are people on this call who know more about that than I do. I would just like to mention that for me, doing this was really an opportunity to learn in a much more nuanced way what it took to achieve suffrage and how long the struggle has gone on. And it also made me value voting. So it left me with I've always thought voting was important, but it left me convinced that after all those battles, that was the lesson to take from this.
And if I could build, go ahead, Connie.
Oh, something else occurred to me, unless Peggy, did you want to say something?
Go ahead, Connie.
Oh, okay. Well, I've been studying the Progressive Era, which was roughly 1890 to 1920 or something, for another. And as this question came up, I thought, one of the things that, yes, abolitionists and suffragists were united, and the Civil War and the emancipation did really take precedence over suffrage. But by the time we got to 1900 or so, there were so many women who were working outside of the home, so many changes in our economy, and there was industrialization. There was so many people were working in factories. We no longer had these household industries. And so it seemed ridiculous that your coworker couldn't vote and you could. and and I don't know, Peggy probably, because she studied this differently than I have, but I do think that by the time we got to 1913, that the fact that women couldn't vote just was increasingly absurd. And also the Western states had passed suffrage acts prior to those on the Eastern Seaboard. So there was that kind of pressure. It was a new land, new attitudes. Women were essential in farm communities. So there were a lot of things going on.
I think Connie has said it, and building on Marion, I would just point out that if you look at the difference between 1848 and the Seneca Falls Women's Convention and 1920, when the amendment was finally passed, and you think of the American population, it's hard for us to put ourselves back in that mid-19th century mindset and appreciate how radical the idea of women voting was. It was so radical that I believe Elizabeth Cady Stanton's husband left town when she insisted on including that in the demands that the convention would make. And so to win the hearts and minds of the country, and as Marion pointed out, the men who at that point held all of the elected offices and were the only one enfranchised to vote, it was a long and difficult road. And by the 20th century, as we saw in Suffragists Speak, Alice Paul was a bit of a master at creating highly dramatic, visible, newsworthy events where the American public was seeing mothers and sisters and daughters being arrested, hauled off to jail, force-fed. And gradually over that time, the critical mass of Americans who believed that women should vote and that it was an outrage that they couldn't grew to the tipping point.
This might be a question for Connie, and I don't know to the extent that you can answer this, but we often tend to think of the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, as an insular movement in America. But when you talked about Alice Paul's travels abroad, we mentioned that she was influenced by the British suffragists. Yeah. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit more about maybe what their influence was on Alice Paul, or maybe even the greater American suffrage movement.
Well, Alice Paul was a rather extraordinary person. She grew up in near Morristown, sort of in southern New Jersey, and was a Quaker. And her mother said something about, but she was such a mild-mannered girl. But she was obviously immensely bright. She went to college, graduated from, I think it was Bryn Mawr, and then she went to England to study social work. And she got, it was the period of the suffragettes in Britain, and who were doing very radical things that were getting them hauled off to jail and forced fed and all of that. And she came back to this country. She was 27, 28 years old. She fortunately had sufficient family money that turning her time into an income was not essential. But she said, oh, in 1912, she moved to Washington, December of 1912, and she said, you know, where is the suffragette movement? You know, how come we aren't doing this here? And there was, as Anne Torrey told the story, or as Carrie Chapman Catt told the story, there was this feeling, we will do this state by state by state, in a sort of a gradual basis. And Alice Paul thought, well, that's ridiculous. You know, look at how slowly you're going. And, you know, we need some drama here. And as I think Peggy mentioned, probably a lot of people who saw their sisters, their mothers, their daughters, their whatever out there protesting. One of Paul's thing were these silent sentinels who stood rain cold, heat cold, rain rain, sun, whatever, outside the White House, putting pressure on Woodrow Wilson, who was not all that enlightened a president, even though he is considered a progressive. But so Alice, when she came back to the US, she got a law degree. She was, I mean, how many women got law degrees in 1910 or 12? Not a whole lot. So Alice was far ahead of her time for whatever reason. So is that an answer?
Yes, it
Did
is.
that help? How many people have been to the Alice Paul Institute?
Right.
I think it's called Paulsville.
It's in Paulsboro.
It's in Paulsville, but it's right near Morristown. It's like, I don't know, about an hour south of Trenton or so on 295. No,
Morris.
it's not.
Morristown is north,
No, it's south.
so it's south.
It's Morristown, not Morristown.
Moors, M-O-O,
Anyway,
like the Moors.
yeah, another nice old New Jersey town. It's a great place to go.
I'm hoping maybe Lorraine can speak a little to this. Was there any sentiment in the African American community among males who didn't feel like their female counterparts should get the right to vote? Or was it a general sense that, the African American struggle is intimately intertwined with the struggle for, women as well? Was it one community, or were there different factions or that thought that maybe women should not have the right to vote?
Well, I can't speak universally, but I will say Frederick Douglass may have stood very much alone on this. Men were men, or I'm sorry, men are men. And it was, first of all, it was very complex, very emotional, very fraught time. When we look at the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. And I don't think men were really looking over and saying, wow, women really ought to be able to have the right to vote. They got it. We didn't. Now if you want to go forward, if you can go as far forward as Fannie Lou, then I think you began to see men feeling more that women needed to be there, because women were, as women always do, taking up the mantle and running forward. I mean, Fannie Lou certainly put her money where her mouth was, if you will, and paid the price for it, and I'm sure died earlier than she might have for the beatings that she took. But by that time, in the 60s, that, remember, we had Martin Luther King, we had civil rights, we had the bus boycott, we had the murder of Emmett Till, we had so activism had begun, and even though women were not allowed to come fully to the fore always, I think men at that point began to be more open about supporting women's rights. Not a whole lot, don't get excited, but some. Well, Barbara Jordan now is another 30 years later. Yeah, so there you go. Anybody else?
I'd just like to, if it's okay, Andrew, to mention again, I would like to affirm Frederick Douglass's fairly extraordinary role in being such a supporter of women's suffrage. And I think one of the interesting, or maybe it's two of the interesting stories here, are the choices then that our characters made that sometimes flew in the face of, for instance, Douglass's commitment. If you look at the things, the history, he was committed to suffrage for women, but he also at a point in time decided that suffrage for the freed men became the priority. And we sort of see Carrie Catt doing what she did to get ratification of the 19th Amendment. So I think part of what to me is interesting about this story are the choices that people made that sometimes weren't always consistent with, their most absolute view of the right to the vote for their partners in this, if you will.
It was what Ida Wells said, that balance between principle and politics, it really boiled down to that. And to get over the finish line for the goal that they were so all consumed by, they were willing to make a moral compromise.
And Peggy, I was going to mention Ida B. Wells' good friend and colleague, T. Thomas Fortune, who lived right here in Red Bank, New Jersey. Can't let you forget that for a while. Fortune stood very much in the way that Douglass did. He believed in rights for everyone, women, men, peoples of all color. And I think he paid the price for that position as well. But he was one man. He was born in 1856. So by the time he came north and started his newspapers, it was the late 1800s. And from then until his death in 1928, he spoke and wrote as if everybody who God put on this green earth should be equal to each other.
Chauvinism here, but Fortune was a New Jersey character, a personality about whom the rest of the state should. In Red Bank, we are aware of his history, but he was like Fannie Lou. How do you speak truth to power? That was good at that.
Before we end it, I noticed, Peggy, you mentioned or used the phrase moral compromise. And it seemed like that was a real theme through the entirety of this, not only this program, but the movements, both for the abolition of slavery, but the women's suffragist movement, as well as the civil rights movement later on. And maybe as we close, I'm just curious what moral compromise means to each one of you, and maybe how it's impacted you after learning about these characters.
That's a provocative and deep question.
Yeah,
it certainly emerged as a theme and raised to our consciousness that the stories that we learned perhaps as children have much more nuance and complexity than we thought. And history, I was just listening to Ken Burns quote somebody, I don't remember whom he was quoting, say, history may not repeat itself, but it rhymes. And you see the same thing in terms of trying to get legislation passed today. There is a new something Right to Vote Act that replaces the For the People Act, which is a compromise of all the things that were originally put in and is now being pushed through Congress. It's a matter of always kind of, what am I willing to give up to get a higher goal? And when we look back on Frederick Douglass or on Carrie Catt or even on Alice Paul, in the stories we told in Suffrage to Speak, their decision to make Black women march at the end of the parade, or leave women out of the 15th Amendment, or play to the Southern politicians that were needed to pass the 19th Amendment. You're doing things that one would believe are probably painful, if not repugnant, but you're doing them in your own mind in the name of a higher good. And I think that goes on to some extent, certainly at the political level and probably at the personal level as well.
It makes me think of the phrase, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I think that, I mean, that's a little simple-minded, but I do think that those are the choices that are frequently made. You know, we to make progress, to do the good, we can't always do the perfect.
And we all have different ideas of
Ideas
exactly
of
what
what-
constitutes good.
Exactly,
And perfect.
That's
So-
for sure.
exactly.
That is for sure.
Certainly playing out in Washington these days, so.
Forever.
And when you think about it, our very Constitution was a moral compromise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, and that
yes.
moral compromise, the 3/5 rule, the absence of the banning of slavery in order to get the Southern colonies to be willing to join the Union, in order to create the Union, they made the biggest moral compromise of our history, the consequences of which we are still living with.
Yes.
Well, first I'd like to thank you ladies for presenting today and sharing not only your experiences, but the important work that still needs to be done too, as well, to continue to tell these stories and make some of these nuanced eras of history more accessible and more understandable to a wider audience. So we truly appreciate all the work that you've done. I'd also like to thank all of our attendees for joining today, and I hope that you found this as enjoyable as I have. And we look forward to you at our future programming. Again, if you have a chance, please complete the survey after this. We all would love to hear your thoughts and your feedback. And as I mentioned before, if you have any questions or you want to get in contact with any of the members of this project, their email is on the screen at suffragistspeak@gmail.com. And I'm sure that they would love to hear anything that you have to say as well. So with that, I'd just like to tell everyone, be safe, be well, and hopefully we can see you soon.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
And thanks to all of you.
And as we depart, I have to say, women may have the right to vote, but you know, there is still not an equal rights amendment. Okay, just saying. Just saying.
Great. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I have to get that.
Okay.